Well, hello everyone. My name is Sarah Pinkham, and I'm the Exhibition and Engagement Coordinator for the Main Library Gallery at the University of Iowa. Thank you for joining us today. The Main Library Gallery is located on the first floor of the main library here on campus, and we produce a new exhibit each semester for which guest curators use storytelling and our archives and materials here at the libraries to share an area of their expertise with our community. This presentation today is part of programming for the Hawkeye Histories Sporting Stories exhibit, which was curated by Dr. Jennifer Sterling and explores facets of Hawkeye sports history. The exhibit is in the main library gallery until December 19th. So if you're around, hopefully you're able to stop by and see us. And it will eventually have a virtual edition available online. So today's talk is a little bit of a behind the scenes and some additional history and a look at the exhibit with the curator. So there will be some time for questions after the talk. So please feel free to add those into the Q&A area for Dr. Sterling to answer. Dr. Sterling is an associate professor of instruction in the Department of American Studies and the School of Journalism and Mass Communications. She teaches a broad range of courses in the sport, media, and culture program, including history of sport in the U.S., women's sport and culture, and sport and globalization. Dr. Sterling has been at the University of Iowa for nearly a decade, following her PhD in kinesiology and physical cultural studies at the University of Maryland, an internship and research position at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, and a postdoctoral fellowship in sports, society, and technology at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Exhibitions have been a frequent topic of her research, scholarship, and teaching, including her contributions to the co-curated with Karin Mason, Susan Birrell, and Tina Parrott traveling exhibit 6-on-6 Basketball and the Legacy of Girls and Women's Sport in Iowa, and of course, Hawkeye Histories. She's been teaching materials with materials from the archives at the University of Iowa for many years. Welcome, Dr. Sterling, and thank you for being here today to share with us.
Thank you all for being here. This is webinar view, so I can't see you all, but I appreciate your attendance and your engagement. And like Sarah said, please include any questions you have as we go along. I'm going to try to spend a little time talking about the exhibit in addition to some behind the scenes decisions that were made about what it was included in the exhibit, how the stories were told, etc. Because I know some of you may have been to the exhibit already and be looking for some supplemental material, but others may have not been. So I will get started with a overview of the exhibit. So like Sarah mentioned, it's up until December 19th. The exhibit is really about having a representative history of sports at the University of Iowa. So making sure that a little bit of every or most stories get told in some part in the exhibit rather than focusing on one particular history or one particular sport or time period. So the exhibit welcomes you with a number of uniforms on display, including gymnastics on the left, over to women's basketball, which of course has been a very popular sport here at the University of Iowa throughout time, but especially recently. And then ending with a rifle sweater. We had rifle teams, both men's and women's, throughout the middle part of the 1900s. So when you walk in the gallery, you are met with sort of four distinct areas that draw your attention to different sort of eras in the sports at the University of Iowa. So this top photo here is looking at the history of PE, which is also included on some text panels behind this case. And really, PE is important to ground here. It's a place where a lot of curriculum and research has come out of the University of Iowa about sports. It is what has attracted athletes to our program, especially in the early 1900s. And it's where athletics was housed until the middle of the 1900s, when we actually, form an athletics department. So our varsity sports were sort of organized out of our physical education departments for men, and lots of different sort of competitive, though not intercollegiate, opportunities for women also organized out of our physical education departments in the early 1900s. So it's an important context that I wanted to speak to before moving to the bottom left-hand photo. This is an introduction to the start of the University of Iowa and our first sports, both men's and women's. And so really kind of looking at this early period from the mid 1800s to the sort of early 19 mid 1920s. And then as you turn the corner there, still in the photo on the left, it talks about sort of the rise of big time athletics for men's sports. And really our big three at Iowa at the time, in particular, football, basketball, and wrestling. And then there's also a case there dedicated to, and I'll talk a little bit about this one later, dedicated to swimming, tennis, and gymnastics, which were also very popular men's sports. Something that would maybe be talked about now as minor sports or non-revenue sports. And these are the three sports that are unfortunately no longer at Iowa due to budget cuts related to COVID shortfalls. So there's a case in the exhibit really dedicated to those histories. And then as you tour around to the right side of the exhibit, there are really what's focused on here or highlighted is the rise of women's athletics, both at Iowa and within the U.S. So early intercollegiate opportunities, and then of course the growing support and success of those sports, especially under the guidance of Christine Grant as the women's athletic director from 1973 to 2000. And then ending in 2024 with our national championship women's wrestling team in their inaugural season. And of course, the second of Iowa's trips to the national championship game with Caitlin Clark. So what I would like to do moving forward, and one thing I have chosen to do, much like the exhibit, I had to make selections about what I was going to talk about today. I have chosen to focus more on some of the older histories. Some of this is because some of our programming has recently sort of touched upon some of the more recent women's sport histories. And then those that are maybe sort of more well known. I have also sort of chosen to leave off, but happy to talk about those in Q&A as well. So one thing I wanted to talk about, the opening text or narrative of this exhibit talks about Caitlin Clark and Niall Kinnick. So these are probably two of our most well-known historically and recent athlete alums. And so some of the beginning text is talking about, from Kinnick to Clark, like what does it look like over the years? And these are two really illustrative figures to talk about that. So I'm just going to start by talking about them because they really play an important part of grounding this exhibit and how we think about athletes and what histories we know about. So I wanted to highlight how difficult it was to think about how to tell the story of Caitlin Clark in this exhibit, especially because the story was ongoing when the exhibit was being created. So, we made an effort to try to collect and borrow so that we would have some items to include in the exhibit as that history was being made. And I just wanted to talk about the decision to include the newspaper. So the unmatched cover from the Des Moines Register, this was printed in advance of her breaking the NCAA women's record. And it was shown, in the celebration, and I thought that was a really good way to sort of capture that history. Although I was hesitant because one thing that often happens with women's sports is that women are often shown passively rather than actively. And that's been a common issue in media representations of women since women started participating in sports and continues to have those issues. So it was a hard decision to not have a picture of the shot itself rather than the magazine. But again, sort of thinking about this particular history. And we managed to kind of work the shot into the exhibit in a different way. So below the case that I showed on the previous slide, There's a 22 decal. It's the same type of decal they have in the um, at Carver Hawkeye Arena to mark the spot where this particular shot was made. It was a 35-foot shot, and so what we did in the exhibit was to put the decal on the floor, which was graciously loaned to us, well, given to us because obviously we can't peel it off and give it back, but given to us by the Department of Athletics. And then there's a hoop on the back wall about middle way across the back wall in the exhibit. And that's the distance to that particular shot. So we were able to work some of the sort of active and thinking about just sort of the performative nature of that by including that sort of interactive piece into the exhibit. And then Kennick, again, this is a story that I think we often assume that people know about the University of Iowa. His he was playing at a time where there was 3 years of eligibility. They didn't allow freshmen to play yet, and in this third year, he has a new coach. There's a tight team of players that are called "quote unquote" Iron Men because of the need for them to play both offense and defense. He leads his team in a number of different categories, leads the team past some really important teams, including Notre Dame, which we highlight in this particular case. Um, And so it was really important that we highlighted not just football, but this particular era that really puts Iowa on the map as far as football is concerned, and something that obviously continues to grow and have an impact here. So those are a couple of stories about some more well-known histories that were really used as, kind of foundations in the exhibit as anchors to different parts of it. And then I will sort of take you through some of the stories that sit behind these early histories in the cases that are highlighting the early and mid 1900s. So the first case on this wall talks about the Board and Control of Athletics, which is our organization prior to the Department of Athletics having control over the things that our board and control used to have control over. So now this organization is now the presidential, sorry, the Presidential Committee on Athletics. And it's more of an advisory role now, whereas in the beginning it was a regulatory role. It was a requirement of institutions to have these types of organizations that were sort of separate from the athletics department as a way to maintain control over the athletics. They were in control of who was hired, how many people were on the rosters, who were awarded letters, and so on and so forth. Um, One particular additional story that is talked about in the exhibit, but I wanted to sort of highlight here. And in addition, I wanted to highlight some of the research that has come out of those the programs that have really emerged from those physical education departments at the start of the university. So this is a graduate of our what at the time was a sports studies program, and again because I've been teaching here for a while and have been developing content around the history of sports at Iowa. I also teach a class called Hawkeye Nation, where we talk a lot about these histories. This is some of the research I've, been able to lean on to develop curriculum, to develop the exhibit, and to introduce my students to. This is Mays McLean. He is was one of our first, and again, I'm still really interested in finding out more about Native and Indigenous athletes at the University of Iowa, but this is one of the histories we do know about. And so he comes here, he's recruited to play for 3 years here, but actually ends his career after one because the Big Ten at the time decides that his years at the Haskell Indian School which was one of the early Native American boarding schools, were going to count towards his eligibility. And so again, 3 years of eligibility at that time because they didn't allow freshmen to play. So he ends up only being able to play for a year, even though he was recruited sort of understanding that he would have 3 years of eligibility here. And this article talks more about how his identity was handled, the different stereotypes that were reported in the newspapers, including the student newspaper here, but also regional and state and local newspapers. And so part of this talk, I'll just point you to some additional research and some of the research that supported the way I developed text, but also additional research if you're interested in reading more about some of these topics. So the next case is the first four. This is sort of it has two meanings here, both the first four sports at the University of Iowa. So thinking about our baseball, basketball, football, and track and field, but also talking about the first four African American athletes at Iowa. And again, some names people may be more familiar with. Fred Duke Slater, our football field was recently named after him. The stadium is named after Kinnick. And then also before Slater, there was Archie Alexander, who was our first African American graduate from the engineering school here. Charles Brookins, who was an interesting story in the sense that a lot of times he wasn't identified as an African American athlete, and so sort of had different. He negotiated his identity a little bit differently at the time, and then I also our very first athlete with Kenny Holbrook, our very first African American athlete in the late 1800s. Um, so this first floor then sort of highlights the start of different sports at Iowa, but also some of our early African American athletes and pioneers. I have a couple stories to sort of tell about some of this information. I have been asked a couple of times about whether there's this history of Iowa that we played the first 5-on-5 basketball game, and this is newspaper reporting. So the Vedette Reporter is the precursor to the Daily Iowan. And this is the report of that particular game. So Chicago 15 and SUI, so the State University of Iowa, which was the University of Iowa previously, 12. So we lose the game. And again, one thing to think about this is, so this happens in 1896. The game of basketball has been around for only a few years. And at the time, it was just sort of played with loose rules. So part of like organizing a conference and organizing this board and control of athletics was to really start standardizing the game of basketball. And we see this with women's basketball happening at the same time. They actually develop a little differently, different rules for women than men, which we still see in many sports. But I just wanted to point out in the bottom of the second column of the article, it talks about the five players on the team. So this was sort of thought about as the first time that the 5-player system that we now see today was played, and this was played in Close Hall, which was dedicated really by to the YMCA at the time. And you'll see also here in the article, it talks about SUI YMCA teams. So again, thinking about how organized sport was organized at the university, and like the university was still developing structures to organize that sport at the time. So the YMCA here played an important role in some of our early teams. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about Brookins. He's an Olympic athlete, a track athlete. This particular article is talking about him setting the world mark in the short distance hurdles. But I also wanted to include, you've seen a couple of newspaper articles now, and you'll see a couple more throughout the talk. I wanted to include some of the sort of deep research that's made available by the digitization of our records of the Daily Iowan and of the yearbooks. And so without this, obviously, we could have physical access to it, to the yearbooks at least, but to access the newspaper and for everyone to be able to read through those would deteriorate them pretty quickly. So these are all digitally accessible. It's a really amazing collection we have here at the university, and was really important in sort of helping me both locate research and sort of or locate topics, but also sort of find some more information. Um, I also wanted to include this from the yearbook. I think I page by page read every yearbook. Maybe there's an exception of a few pages here and there, or a yearbook here and there. But I would often run into these really interesting stories. And so this one in particular, it talks about the first annual Hawkeye cross country run that happens in 1923. And they talk about how the prizes consist of poultry for the first five finishers and then an egg for the last person. So here you see that Brookins in this particular race, so even though he's a sprinter, he runs cross country. He actually played football as well. Multi-sport athletes were far more common in our early history than they are today. So you can see that he wins the rooster, even though the turkey is given out as a first prize, the goose is the second, the duck is the third, and then the hen as the fifth, and then mentions who is the one that was awarded the egg. So I really adore finding these histories and sharing them. But again, it's an example of some of the histories that, I did not necessarily include in the exhibit, but wanted to use today to share some of these. So this is another example. There was a lot of different items and histories I could have used to talk about the history of baseball here at Iowa. But I found a number of examples of this team visiting from Japan, Waseda, and they showed up in a number of photo albums and the photography work of the like campus photographers at the time. And so you can see on the top photo, the one that we ended up including is sort of the Waseda team as they're playing, but also there are a number of other photos in a broader photo album. And it shows the team itself over on the left, so not playing, but posed. And then on the right, there is a article talking about their visit and how they're being welcomed. And again, this is interesting to kind of think of the timing. This takes place in 1911, and it's actually the first of, or it's actually the second of a number of visits. So there's two sort of histories, parallel histories developing at the time. And again, a lot of this is discussed in some really great historical work that's been done by scholars in the field, and thinking about these first Japanese American ball players. So these Japanese American ball players are creating these barnstorming teams um, during like the early to mid, early to like mid tens. And they usually develop on the West Coast and then tour throughout the US. At the same time, sport is developing or baseball is developing as a popular sport in Japan. And there's a number of teams that do these world tours, and Waseda University is one of them. And so Iowa is one of the teams that they tour or they play against during their second tour. So their earlier tour happened earlier in the 1900s. And again, it's just a really, really interesting history to think that Iowa was part of this like broader history of Japanese American baseball, Japanese baseball, and also thinking sort of how this history um, is positioned prior to World War I and II. So really thinking about some of the histories that start developing, and also like a history that happens later on is the development or the play of softball and baseball during World War II in the camps where Japanese American citizens were quarantined to during that war. So again, some additional histories to read about, but one that might not necessarily come through from that single photo that we have in the exhibit, and one I wanted to expand upon a little bit. Um, so the next history I want to talk about a little bit and really highlight an early athlete here. Her name's Pauline Spencer. And so, like I said earlier, men's sports are developing women's sports are developing alongside of men's sports. Men's sports have these intercollegiate opportunities, and they are governed by the Board and Control of Athletics. There is no similar sort of organization for women, both either as a conference or as a national organization or on campus. So the physical education Department of Physical Education for Women at the time, there's a number of students who develop and are supported by that department, the student organization. So the Women's Athletic Association, later named the Women's Recreation Association. And they develop their sort of own rules, their own requirements for letters. So a little bit more about this. Again, another newspaper article here talking about Pauline Spencer and her creation, along with seven of her co-eds, so seven of her women colleagues create this organization and then create this point system as well. So Pauline Spencer is we can kind of point to as our first letter winner on campus, even though women's varsity sports don't start here until 1973. So they're not awarded letters by the athletics, by UI Athletics until 1973, but they are awarded letters by the Women's Recreation Association and the Women's Athletic Association prior to that. So here are some of the items that are included, including the little name tags from a basketball banquet that they have in the early 1920s. And then I also wanted to point out that the notebook in the center of the case on the bottom right is Pauline Spencer's. And so it's the same woman who appears in the letter jacket photo on the little name tag, and then also within the conversation around women's physical education. It was a really rigorous and scientifically based program. And so this particular notebook was also in her collection. So also just to kind of think about these wonderful diverse collections we have that talk about lots of different types of histories. So this particular notebook I've always really admired, and I'm glad we could include it. But again, I don't think it's something that always gets connected in the exhibit, that the same people that are showing up in this case are showing up in another space as well. So thinking about her role as a physical education student, as an athlete, and really as an advocate, an early advocate for women's sports on campus. So one of the things that we also highlight in this part of the exhibit is some co-ed spaces, so where men and women were either competing with or sharing sort of sporting opportunities, so especially around archery, riflery, and swimming. They did have different swimming pools at the time. That's come up in a different talk. But they often did these elaborate sort of displays together. And one thing that really struck me when I was working on this exhibit that I don't think is fully explained or fully highlighted in the exhibit is the importance of the Iowa River in both athletics and recreation here at the University of Iowa. So yes, we have our rowing team now and the boathouse on the river, but there were earlier versions of rowing and earlier versions of the boathouse. And there was canoeing for classes, there was competitions, there was swimming and ice skating and on our men's swim club, which eventually turns into our men's swim team, was started by a group of people who were quote unquote lifesavers in the river, lifeguards in the river or on the river during the summertime. So I know we wouldn't think of jumping into the water now, but at the time it was this really integral part of campus athletics and recreational culture. And still very much it still very much split the campus, right? There were still parts of campus on both sides of the river. So it's always been this sort of joining and dividing feature of campus. So this is the part of the exhibit where we sort of turn the corner away from the early 1900s and head into the mid 1900s. And this is situated within a larger sort of rise in college sports. So as college sports become more popular, there is, of course, more athletes playing. There is increased desegregation, not integration at this moment. But this is to highlight, again, instead of just talking about first in terms of African American athletes, this is to highlight some of the ongoing success of African American athletes and also some of the trials and tribulations. So this was a time when gentlemen's agreements or agreements between coaches to not play their African American players um, were still very active. And I so these are again we can look at these players as all having these successes. So everything from Simon Roberts, who is a wrestler, to George Roddy, who is a golfer in the 30s, Roberts in the 50s, our first African American basketball player, Culberson in the 40s. So really, just continuing to kind of think through the experiences that these athletes would have had during this time. And one, again, just kind of pointing to some research that supports the development of this particular narrative, and that also is coming from alum from the program. This is Jamie Schultz's Moments of Impact, and where she highlights several different players from Iowa. So Jack Trice at Iowa State, and here kind of thinking about Ozzie Simmons and the tale of Floyd of Rosedale, which I think is a fairly common tale at this point. But again, this is sort of a example of some deeply researched ongoing conversation about his experiences while he was here and how some of that and these are all players that faced injury or death due to racialized experiences on the field. So again, kind of thinking about progress, but also sort of the cost of that progress that was happening at the time. And I should also mention it's outside of what I'm talking about today, but there were early African American women athletes in the WAA and WRA. Corrine Mathis is someone that we highlight in the exhibit. So again, a little bit less known about those histories. They're not as they're not as deeply recorded, but that's one of the things that will hopefully continue to be developed after the exhibit. Yeah, and then just as evidence of big time college athletics, so the rise of March Madness, and the NCAA doesn't start hosting national championships until the 20s and 30s, and they sort of continue to add them in different sports as they move along. And this example is of a poster from the 1955 Big Ten champs. It's the first time our team, our men's basketball team goes to to the national tournament. It's also pretty recent after the tournament expands to 16 teams. So that's an expansion to 16 teams, whereas we play with well over 60 teams in the tournament now. So this is as they're moving more and more towards bigger and more popular tournaments. And this was a move by this was an expansion to accommodate the winners of each conference. So I just wanted to show a little bit about what the brackets look like because they look quite different than what we see during March Madness today. So the 1955 championship bracket on the left, and then the 56 championship bracket when we return and get all the way to the finals and lose to Bill Russell's San Francisco team in 1956. So again, looking at, there's fewer teams, there's not those first round games, a few less Cinderellas than what we see today. But just really showing like, even though this was a major growth and an increasing popularity of the sport, it was really just the beginning of the sort of March Madness as we know it today. And this is a case I was talking about earlier with the men's gymnastics, tennis, and swimming teams. Gymnastics wins the national championship in 1969. There is a really short newspaper article about it, and other than that, there's not a whole lot of evidence. It's revisited more recently, especially when the team was cut after the 2020-21 season. In a nice sort of longer piece in the Daily Iowan. But I wanted to point out this is article or part of a book written by David Armbruster, who is our swim coach at the time, and Jack Sieg, who is one of his athletes. So this is the early development of the dolphin stroke, what we now call the dolphin. It was developed by a number of different people in a number of different ways. There's sort of like this parallel development going on. But one of the first people to really put it together as a modified breaststroke. So it was used like when people competed with a breaststroke, this is when the dolphin stroke was first used to speed up the breaststroke. So eventually it became so much faster than the breaststroke that and so much different that they split it into a different stroke altogether. But when it was being developed, it was being developed as a way to increase the performance of the breaststroke. So that's an important history, again, one that's frequently told, but one that's very, very complex, again, that we haven't sort of fully unpacked in the exhibit, but one very important to note that I wanted to spend a little time on today. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit, I didn't mention these earlier when I was giving this overview, but if you look on either side of the middle column, there's some maps in the background. On the sides of the column, you can't see them in this particular photo, there's some roster infographics. So one of the things that I worked with students in my classes to develop as part of the exhibit was to start building out a database that's comprehensive of every athlete that's ever played here at any time, whether they were letter winners or not. We have better letter winner data than we do like roster data, but we're working on sort of cross-referencing 7 to 8 different places. Women have less places to cross-reference than the men's teams do. And really be able to develop this history and tie them to the areas that they originated from so we can kind of track some of the hometown impacts of these athletes as well. So it's called Hometown Teams, is a sort of larger project, but also that section of the exhibit. So I wanted to share a few of these maps a little more up close. So for example, men's basketball in the upper on top there and men's wrestling in the bottom, you can see slightly different geographic distributions of those two teams. And then we are planning to move these into interactive maps online in the future so people can sort of move them along, see when the trends change, that type of thing. But I also wanted to share with you some of the information that we came across when we were digging out data for this exhibit. So these are index cards kept by the Letter Winners Club. And one of the interesting trends, it's a small trend, but it's a really interesting trend amongst many, many others. There's a batch of cards that are from Hawkeye, Iowa, and I'm really interested in developing a history around Hawkeyes from Hawkeye, mostly baseball players. But there are a few uh, there are a few athletes who have name changes noted, and they have name changes noted particularly around sort of a post-World War II era. And a lot of those name changes seem to indicate that there was some pressure or that like they felt a need to change their name based on, again, an ethnic or a ethno-religious identity. So this is an example of something that sort of emerged during the course of the exhibit rather than being something we were looking for in the exhibit. That I sort of wanted to share with you again, just sort of as that behind and beyond the exhibit stories today. So I think I have just a few slides left here, and then I'm looking forward to questions, possibly. Oh, there we go. Okay. So the slides I have remaining, I've left a blank slide in here to remind myself, these are not things we talk about in the exhibit, but things that I'm very fully aware of, things I know I haven't uncovered yet, that I'm really interested in learning more about. But I, again, wanting to use the opportunity today to kind of think through some of these stories that exist as well. So there's a range of sport and recreational practices on campus. Skiing is one of the really interesting ones I've come across in a number of different photos. There were classes offered. There were groups, especially co-ed groups that would go skiing together. I'm super curious about where they skied in Iowa and just, finding more information. There is a couple of mentions of polo early on. Again, thinking about the history of early colleges and universities and polo as a sport that maybe would have appealed to especially the elite group that would have first had access to those educational opportunities. So again, still digging for information on that one. And then I also wanted to sort of talk about the really like long ongoing presence of men's rugby and men's ice hockey. And then later women's rugby and women's ice hockey as well. Rugby in particular has played an important part in some recent histories, especially around like the reinstatement of the women's swimming team, which was initially cut after that 2020-21 season with due to the budget shortfalls due to COVID. But they've been reinstated. Part of that lawsuit that helped them get reinstated and actually initiated our women's wrestling program was also joined by a women's rugby player. And so kind of thinking about the different sort of club statuses on campus and the important role that they continue to play. I also wanted to highlight the Roland Hawks, which was a wheelchair basketball team that existed here the late 70s and early 80s. Again, thinking about when those opportunities occurred, who helped organize them, ongoing sort of inclusivity and accessible opportunities on campus. And then thinking about also sort of managers and trainers. These are both pages from yearbooks that are pointing out that these are often the people sort of forgotten behind the scenes, the sports information directors, communications folks. There's a lot of people that are not on display that are very key to the history of athletics here. So continuing to amplify some of those histories. Um, and then, of course, some of the histories of um, our what is now our spirit squad or dance team. Men, cheerleading or cheer or yell leaders were very much a men's activity in the U.S. Until post World War II. Um, and these are just some early examples, both from the 1924 yearbooks. You'll see it says established in 1922. Some of the early yearbooks have a couple of years delay on them. But the Shouting Sisters on the left, thinking about women's sort of early roles in this, and then the Howling 300, or sort of the early examples of some of the fan groups we have on campus now. And then a patent up there on the top of some of the early Herky attempts, not just the icon, but actually being able to wear something and have a mascot on the field. And I've left here with a marching band photo, a couple of hearts. Again, this is one of these near and dear topics as well that isn't highlighted as much as it could be in the exhibit, but certainly a really important part of athletics here.